All right, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to Understanding the IEP. My name is Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa and I'm joined by Kim Madden, and we're both going to be presenting together today's offering. So as everybody comes in, I'm going to be launching some polls, and I will also be pausing the recording for this period until we get started. Okay, so we'll pause now and come back in a second. Okay, so now we're going to get started for today's presentation and a couple of housekeeping issues. The first is that you should be able to get a copy of this presentation via email and the email that you use for registration. It is also going to be archived in our YouTube page. It's Advocates for Children of New York YouTube. And finally, again, for those of you who are here, if you wish to ask us a question, we would encourage you to use the Q&A feature, and we will take questions as we go along. At the end of the presentation, once we stop the recording, we may take some live questioning, but for the time being and during the recording, we would appreciate that you use the Q&A. Fair enough? Yeah, we can go. All right. Oops, let me use the proper computer to do this. Oh no, there we go. Okay, so today's training. So today, our goal for today is really to talk about understanding the IEP. So we are really going to be working in reading through the IEP, and we're going to go through all the sections of the IEP. And we hope to show you how to identify and read the relevant sections of the IEP. But first, before we're going to do a little introduction and tell you a little bit about us, we're going to just do a brief overview of the law. And then we're really going to be going deeper into each section of the IEP and their significance and importance and things that you need to look for, and a little bit more about the IEP meetings and problem solving. Okay. So for those of you who do not know us, we are Advocates for Children of New York, and we are an independent agency that protects the rights of all New York City students. We've been around for over 50 years, and originally, although we started as by parents of students with disabilities, our mission has expanded to encompass protecting every child's rights to an education. Our services include a free helpline that works 4 days a week from Monday through Thursday from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. We have a ton of guides and resources at advocatesforchildren.org under the Get Help section. Our guides or resources are available in multiple languages and encompass information from early childhood through transitioning and graduating from high school. We offer workshops and trainings on site, in person, as well as online, like what we're doing today, and they're all free. And of course, we offer free services to families of low income. The first step in contacting us is always going to be to reach us through our helpline. We have dedicated education advocates who are experts on New York City education law and can provide you guidance on a specific issue. Okay, so feel free to call us. Again, our services are free and we serve all 5 boroughs of New York City. Okay. You should also take a look and visit us on our website. This is where you're going to find information about action items and policy pieces that we may be working on, but also it's exactly under this Get Help section right here. You should be able to access all the resources and publications that we have available. Okay. And if you go to our YouTube page, you should find something like this. And you can see a sampling of some of the presentations that we have created in just the last year, including behavioral supports for students with disabilities and services for pre-K and other preschool options, all the way to protecting the rights of students with disability, et cetera. I would really encourage you to take a look and explore some of what we can offer. All right. So in general, starting with the IEP, And I'm just going to take this question really quickly, because if you're not a low-income family, are you able to still seek support? Yes, we answer all your questions, and we can provide guidance on matters that are related to education. What we cannot offer is representation for families who are not income eligible. Okay. So today we're not going to be conducting a full Special Education 101 workshop. We encourage you to go to our YouTube page and take a look at our special education specific workshops, because we're going deeper today, and we're going to be working specifically on how to read the IEP. But we do want to tell you about some of the main concepts that exist for the IEP. So you might be familiar with the two federal laws that provide rights to children with disabilities in schools. There is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, for which we have a full webinar available, and the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. Today, we're exclusively going to be focusing on the IDEA, but you should also be aware that Section 504 provides accommodations for students and parents as well with disabilities. Okay. Now, if you are here, you probably have some familiarity with the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP. Now, the IEP is intended to be an individualized program based on the student's specific needs. It is legally binding, like a contract. So whatever appears written on the IEP is mandated to be provided to the student. So it's not a suggestion. If it appears on the IEP, the Department of Education of the City of New York has to provide that to a student. So it is like a contract in that way. It is good for 1 year, so it should be reviewed on an annual basis. It is created at a meeting, so the parent is a very important part of the team that creates the IEP, and you are entitled to get a copy of this IEP so that you can review the information and ensure its accuracy. It's not a favor that the Department of Education does for you. You are completely entitled to a copy of this IEP. Now, in looking at just this basic information about what the IEP is, we say that the IEP is good for 1 year and that it has to be reviewed annually, but you should also know that you have the right to request IEP meetings as needed. If you believe that your child needs different services, more services, additional services, you can make requests in writing for another IEP meeting. You do not have to wait until the review comes up, okay? And when we talk about based on student needs, one thing that might be overlooked is that when we say based on student needs, we really mean it. It is based on what the child needs to be able to make progress. It is not based on what's available or how much it costs, or if you ever heard of a specific type of service. If your child needs a service, you have the evaluations that show that the child needs a service, that service then should be included on the IEP. So far, so good? All right. Now, the central piece of special education is that, and what we call the promise of special education, is that special education is supposed to be specially designed instruction that adapts as appropriate to the child's needs. It is custom tailored and uniquely created to meet the needs of a student. Each of these words, free, appropriate, public education, of course, has particular meaning, but what you can take away from this is really that, of course, the services are free. They're provided from the Department of Education, from the evaluations to arranging services. No money should come out of your pocket for special education services. And appropriate, which is the really operating word here, means that the programs and services that are offered by special education have to be uniquely designed for the student's needs. Nobody else's, just the student's unique needs. Special education services provided to a student must provide a meaningful benefit. This means that it has to be measurable and anticipated benefit, not just something that happens casually. So that when an IEP creates a goal, for example, it is because it is something that it is believed that the student can accomplish and achieve. And this has to be based on their unique abilities and needs. And when receiving appropriate services that enable a student to make progress, then that student should be expected to accomplish or reach as close as possible to the goals established. Okay. Now, the definition of appropriate, which is that appropriate is a Chevy and not a Cadillac, comes from a Supreme Court case. We didn't come up with it, but in essence, it means that special education and appropriateness is not a broken down bike. It is not Cadillac, which is the one at the very end, the very luxurious looking car with all the frills and thrills and state of the art services, but it is just what's needed to make progress. And we don't mention this so that you do not seek the services that your child requires, but rather to remind you that the services that special education needs to provide have to be our services that your child needs to make progress. These are not luxury services for a child. These are the unique services that your child urgently needs to be able to get from point A to point B. So they're not a luxury. And when you're speaking about special education, we want you to think about special education not as a favor or something that is a nice thing to get, but something that is urgently needed for your child to be able to have success in school, to be able to meet their own individual goals. So when you're speaking to the Department of Education, you should remember that it is just the basic pieces that they need to progress, and that it is not something that should be considered a luxury at all. Okay. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No.
So far, so good? Okay, great. Now, special education has to be offered in the least restrictive environment. And in the least restrictive environment means that in as much as possible, students with disabilities have to be educated with students who are typically developed. The goal of the least restrictive environment, or LRE, is inclusion. And so this means that we're going to consider what services can we offer a student so that they can accomplish their goals, that they can meet the appropriateness requirement of the IDEA as close as possible to the general education population. Now, this does not mean that we're going to place a child in a less restrictive environment just to see how it goes. But this means is that the services are going to be thoughtfully created to ensure that a student is supported so that they can make progress in a setting that is as close as they are able to be in while maintaining their individual goals to the general education environment. And I'll give you some examples in just a minute. So for example, so the Department of Education has a continuum or a menu of services and placements that are based on the student needs and evaluation results, and also input from the IEP team members, which include the parents. These services are available in different sections. So for example, districts 1 through 32, which are your typical Department of Education community schools. They inside these district 1 through 32 schools, you're going to find an assortment of types of classrooms, from general education with support services to integrated co-teaching classes to small classroom sizes that might include, as we'll talk later, a proportion of 12 students and one teacher, or an ICT classroom that might include a proportion of 25, 28 with 2 teachers, to general education with pull out or push in special education teacher supports and services or related services. And then you can go more restrictive, further away from where you have general education, non-specialized schools, to District 75, special education, specialized schools that could be co-located and are for the most part co-located inside District 1 to 32 schools. But these District 75 school settings are smaller schools that are self-contained and that have all small classes, and of course, some inclusion. But the idea being that the further you get from District 1 through 32, the more restrictive it is, because the students need highly specialized supports, specialized services, adult supervision, etc. More restrictive than District 75 is now you're leaving your community to go to a private setting through a non-public school placement for a day program, or more restrictive, a residential program where you're even further away from your District 1 to 32, your non-specialized school setting. Okay, so far so good? Thank you. All right, now entering into the sections of the IEP. Now, the IEP is a multi-page document. Once it's printed out, it can have a different number of pages depending on how much information is included in each of the sections. But it's divided by sections, and the sections can be somewhat summarized by saying that some sections will talk specifically about the student's specific needs. And each of the sections is particularly important because all of the sections work together and all the information works together to create a profile of what the child might need and also what the school will provide to be able to implement that promise of appropriate services that will enable the student to make progress. Okay, so the first piece that we're going to talk about is student needs. You have name, your classification of disability, the implementation date of the IEP, which means when the IEP is when the IEP services are going to begin, when the next IEP meeting is slated to happen. Now, remember, you can request another meeting if needed. The child's present levels of performance or needs, and also the goals that are established for the student for the time frame of the IEP and the reporting that is going to be offered to parents. It also should include what the school will provide. So what programs or services. We'll talk later about compensatory services and also testing accommodations and transition. Now, compensatory services we'll talk about later, but just not to leave you in suspense, is services in compensation for missed instruction or inappropriate instruction. We will have, I think Kim will discuss that piece. And then transition services, which are the set of services that are, sorry, I just got distracted. Yeah. So the set of transition services is really just a coordinated set of activities for a student to prepare for life after high school. I think that's the easiest way I can describe it. And then we're going to go to the next section of the IEP, which is, I'm sorry, with the next section of these two slides, which is speaking not just about the student needs and what the school will provide, but also testing, how a student is going to be promoted, inclusion with students without disabilities, and of course, busing and transportation if needed. And then there are pieces that are additional and also very important, which are the placement type. What is the type of classroom that the student is going to be in? What are the students' instructional levels? There is a summary of all this information we're going to discuss in the IEP, the accessibility, promotional criteria, and other options that may have been considered. At the end of it, there's also information about the meeting attendance, which is something that you sign when you go into the meeting. Okay. Now the first section of the IEP. Okay. Now, important here is in the yellow, here in the yellow oval, you'll see the projected date that the IEP is going to be implemented. So if you're creating an IEP in the summertime, or at some point during the year, it is always important to look at when it is that the services are supposed to begin, because you don't want to make an assumption as to when the services might commence. If you're worried about or you're not familiar with what your child's disability classification, you can find it here. In this case, we have other health impairment. And then over here, we see also the projected date of the annual review. So when it is that you can expect to have another meeting, or by when you're supposed to have another meeting. Now, speaking about disability classifications, we sometimes get questions about why it is that classification is necessary. You may know this, but the federal law requires that a student have a classification of a disability that impacts their learning in order to be eligible to receive special education services. And for that reason, it needs to be included on the IEP. Then this is the longer section of the IEP, which is the present levels of performance and individual needs. And it can have multiple pages. It could be rather short, but that is where you want to see updated evaluation results that reflect your child's immediate needs and areas of strengths as well. Let's see. I actually wanted to talk about the classifications a little bit more. So let me get to that. So as I mentioned, to be able to be eligible to receive special education services, your child has to have a condition or a disability that affects their educational performance. The federal law has established these as classifications. So think of these they're not diagnoses, they're really only useful for the purposes of special education. But what they do is they open the door to receive special education services. Now, a student might have more than one possible classification of disability. So you might have a student who has an emotional disability, forgive us for not updating that piece, an emotional disability, a learning disability, or a multiple disabilities, but only one classification is really selected to be placed on the IEP. Now, that does not mean, of course, that the IEP is going to ignore your child's other needs in favor of the classification. It just means that that was the one that was selected, and this, as you know, as it is done by committee, there may be different reasons why an IEP team may discuss using one classification over another. But I guess I would say we're not as concerned with the classification, but for the fact that these are essentials to be able to obtain special education services. As I mentioned earlier, the present levels of performance, which is usually the longest section of the IEP, should include current standardized scores that include academic, social, and physical development sections, as well as management needs. What is it that a student needs in the classroom to be able to function there? And there is also a section for parent concerns. So if you have a particular worry, or if you have a particular concern that you want included in the IEP, you are welcome and have a right to include that information, okay? Now, when you look at the IEP yourself, you might notice that there's some bolded sections, and these are good guides to help you navigate the IEP itself. So you can find the sections that you might be interested in highlighting or in just looking into a little bit more deeply. Okay. There is the next section. Within the present levels of performance, or the PLOB, we're going to talk about there are some certain student needs and special factors that might be overlooked if you're going through it too quickly. So look for the bolded section, and you'll see student needs relating to special factors. And one of them, and you'll see in the red oval here, is behavior plan, behavioral intervention. Does the student need strategies, including positive behavioral intervention supports and other strategies to address behaviors that impede the student's learning or that of others? So if you're getting phone calls from the school, if your child's behavior is interfering with their learning or interfering with instruction, that usually would say yes. If it says no, then that's something that you might need to bring up. Does the student need a behavior intervention plan? If you believe your child needs a behavioral assessment to look into behavior and then to create a behavior intervention plan, then that's a part that you might want to take a look into as well. If you're following along at home with the IEP and with your own child's IEP, this might be one where you might want to take your Sharpie out and highlight it, especially if you're getting phone calls from school or if this is something that is of concern to you. If your child has limited English proficiency and they need a special education service to address their language needs, that should also appear in the section that is yellow over here, okay? If the answer is no, then it's not something that you need to worry about. Um, Same idea for students who are blind or visually impaired. If they need instruction in Braille and the use of Braille, this section here will take addresses that piece. And one that is actually relatively common is, does the student need a particular device or service to address their communication needs? So this section is specific to the communication needs of deaf or hard of hearing students, but also other students who might need communication devices, okay? And then finally, we'll see down here if the student needs an assistive technology device and or service. And assistive technology refers to any computer tool or device that assists a student to in the classroom or at home. For example, FM units, fidgets, computers, software, books with big fonts, weight pencils. All of these things can be obtained for a student depending on their needs. And if they require it, then this has to be checked off. Okay. Okay. Now, so for starting the year that a student, well, starting the IEP that is in effect for the year that a student turns 15, the Department of Education has to start looking at measurable post-secondary goals. So what is it that the student is interested in doing as an adult? This is something that should match a section that comes in later. That is the transition page, the transition section, which talks about the coordinated set of activities that are going to be put in place to enable a student to reach their post-secondary goals. So post-secondary goals could include, for example, going to college, university, or career training and education, etc. Interestingly enough, this section in the IEP does not have a dedicated diploma option part. And so this is, when you're coming into the measurable post-secondary goals, a good time to talk about what type of diploma the student is going to be working towards and what they might need, what type of diploma they might need, or what type of credential they might need to be able to reach their independent goals, okay? Yeah. All right. Each IEP for each student should have annual goals. And annual goals are basically, what do we expect and anticipate the student to be able to achieve by the end of the time that this IEP is in effect, for each of the areas where they need special education services. The annual goals have to be measurable, so you should be able to read the annual goal and know what it is that the student should be accomplishing and what is going to be measured, how often, and how. And of course, a goal per each need. You can't really have an IEP that reflects a student needs and not establish a goal per each of the needs. And you also have the right to request progress reports. Now, in the case of the slide that you're looking at, you'll see that the annual goal here, it says, when presented with words from reading narratives for specific informational text, the student will use combined knowledge to read accurately unfamiliar multisyllabic words out of context. So we know that that's the goal for this student. The criteria to measure if the goal is going to be that they have attempted this and accomplished this accurately in 4 out of 5 trials as measured by the method, teacher provider observation and teacher made materials, and progress will be measured 1 time per quarter. In the middle of the page, you see where it says progress reports. You, as a parent, have a right to request not just the progress reports, the 4 progress reports per quarter that are included on the IEP, but you see on the bottom of the page, it says reporting progress to parents. If you believe that you need to be updated more frequently as to your child's progress towards the annual goal, you have the right to make a request in this section. Now, we haven't included a separate slide on benchmarks, which are short-term goals that are available for preschool age students and also for students who are not subject to the New York Standard promotional criteria, so students who have significant disabilities and who are subject to alternate assessment. These short-term goals have to be reviewed within a shorter time frame. And so they're a little different than the annual goals, which are what are pretty much established for the majority of students between the ages of 5 and 21. When you're talking about the annual goals, we're not talking about promotional criteria just yet. There's a different section that we will discuss that talks about promotional criteria. This is just really what we expect the student to be able to accomplish within special education, okay? Now, if you're me, when we look at IEPs, I often just go straight to this section. This is what I find to be the most informative section and sort of a summary of everything that the IEP says. So everything that we discussed leading up to this point is intended to just set the table for this, which is what type of special education program and services a student will need to implement the goals to ensure that they're receiving appropriate services in the least restrictive environment. And so here you find the type of classroom setting, the related services, including ratios, so how many students are going to be in the classroom or in the location when your child is receiving counseling or speech language services or physical therapy, the start date of the services, and how often, and how long, and where. So taking a look at this, we'll see that for this specific student, a special education program is set special education teacher supports and services. Recommended delivery, it says direct services and group services 3 times a week during a period of class for ELA. And it's going to be offered not push-in, but in a separate location in the SETS room. And the projected date of the service, the beginning of the service is, I guess, the first day of school, September 8th of 2022, okay? So when you're looking at that information in your IEP, if you're following along with your own child's IEP, you might be able to recognize some of these. And also remember, as we said much earlier, that anything that is written on the IEP has to be provided to your child. So please make sure that what appears here in this very important section is actually being offered to your child. Okay. Now, there's also supplementary aids and modifications and accommodations that are provided as needed for a student. And this might include individualized one-to-one paraprofessionals or nurses and support specific needs like toileting, health needs, or for behavior, for example. It's important to know the duration, so how long it's going to be, and the ratio, so that there is no misunderstanding as to if your child needs it. For example, in this case, I'm going to skip to the bottom part where it says skilled nursing services, an individual service. So this is not something that is shared with anybody else. This person is assigned to your child and your child alone for daily services full time. And this person has to be in close proximity to the student in the student's classroom. You see above where it says that there is a paraprofessional for health and supporting toileting, for example. That's an individual service daily, but it is not full-time. So if you're hoping that your child receives full-time paraprofessional support, please make sure that you note the duration. If you're hoping that your child receives individual support, please make sure that you note the ratio and where the service needs to be offered as well. Because if your child has specific and complex needs, the IEP should reflect those needs so that your child can be properly supported. Okay? All right. In addition, if your child needs assistive technology and also support for school staff, you may include that in the IEP. So assistive technology devices and services. So actually, this is something that Kim had spoken to me about recently that I thought was very interesting. And that is that sometimes we think about assistive technology only as devices and tools that a student can use to be able to participate more fully in the classroom and to establish a level playing field for them. So we think about fidgets, like I mentioned earlier, we think about computers or communication devices like the iPad, but there's also services for the devices. So software updates or training for staff to be able to use these devices and to update as needed. Um, Something to also think about when discussing assistive technology and devices and other supports is where those services are going to be available. If the IEP says school, then the device might not be available at home. However, if the IEP says that you should be able to have your assistive technology device in school and at home, then that gives you permission to take it out of school and use it at home as well. So if that's something that matters for your child's development, then this is something that should be included. I wanted to highlight in the bottom part of this slide where it says indirect AT services. So there is here AT prep and adaptation of instructional materials so that staff can actually have these services ready for the student to be able to then incorporate and use with their own devices. Okay. All right, so typically a student will be in school for 12 months. I'm sorry, for 10 months. That is your typical September through June school year. Now, for students who require additional continued support for 12 months because of regression that can occur during the summer, because of needs for predictable and continued services and support, you can get extended school year services, and these can be marked on the IEP as a 12-month service and program. The 12-month service could be the same as the school year service, or there can be an explanation as to what services and support and a description they're going to receive over the summer. So they can get same or different services that during the school year. And remember, these are services that are intended to prevent regression. Now, extended school year services are not summer school. This is not because a student is failing. This is because they need specialized services over the summer to prevent this regression. Now, for those of you who are familiar with summer rising, students who have extended school year can also receive summer rising services. They can participate in summer rising because they can have their own academic specialized component at the beginning part of the day and combine that with the enrichment and the fun part that summer rising is supposed to offer the second part of the day. So if you have a child who's receiving extended school year services and you're considering summer rising, but you're worried that they might not be able to get their special education support because you want to enroll them in the summer rising program whenever that information comes up, do know that they're entitled to continue receiving their special education services, and that summer rising will have to adapt to what those services might be so that they can participate in both. Okay. All right. And then earlier we mentioned compensatory services, and this is a new section that is being included in the IEP. And probably for the time being, we're not sure how long it's going to be there, but the purpose of this section in compensatory services is to address the learning loss that was experienced by a lot of students with disabilities during the COVID era, during the school closings and remote learning. The purpose of compensatory services is to make a student whole, where there was a loss of instruction or where services were not appropriate, and as a result, the student didn't receive the services that they were entitled to under their IEP, and particularly where they made to make progress, the Department of Education is required to offer compensatory services so that that the student can then try to get to where they should have been today if they had received the services in a timely fashion. So to ensure that this COVID learning loss and the loss of appropriate services is properly addressed, the Department of Education is including this section in the IEP. And so if you're having an IEP meeting in the next coming months, please understand that you will have this piece and it really has to be discussed. If it is not discussed in the IEP or if it's glossed over, please ask to talk about whether your child experienced regression or stagnation or just a learning loss during COVID, so that you can add additional services that would be companions to what's offered in the regular IEP services. So these are not to substitute what your child needs today. These are in addition to regular IEP services. Okay. The next section of the IEP that you're going to be discussing, I'm sorry, my voice is sort of breaking now, is testing accommodations. So testing accommodation refers to testing conditions. So how your child is going to be tested. We're not talking yet about modifications. It's basically about getting a scribe, or if you need your questions read out loud, or if you need text read out louder, if you have to go into a different location. So it is really about the conditions under which your child is going to be tested. It could apply to different tests. It could be applied to state and local assessments. It can also more specifically apply to classroom quizzes. It really depends on what your child specifically needs. And oftentimes you're going to find that it's extra time or calculators or separate location and breaks. But these have to be really individualized to your child's specific needs. It could be breaks during the test, for example, for a student who has testing anxiety, but it could really be anything that your child needs so that their testing conditions are appropriate to address their specific requirements. Okay, so if you see the information in front of you, this is not an exhaustive list. We go back to the beginning of the special education presentation to remind you that this is all based on what your child needs. So if your child needs something that is different to be able to make progress, and in this case, to be able to be tested appropriately, then that is what needs to be included in the IEP. And now we go into transition activities. So again, for students whose IEP is in effect in the year that they turn 15, right? And sometimes younger, if it's determined that it's needed, you're going to find that this is the companion part of those post-secondary goals. And the idea is that you first establish what it is that the student wishes to do with their life, what their goals are, what their dreams are. And then we're going to make it more practical. We're going to talk about those transition activities, so that what are we going to do? What is it that needs to be in place for the student to be able to then accomplish those goals that they have already mentioned? So it could be specific instruction. So school-based and specific instruction. It could be community experiences, additional related services, daily living skills, or different types of assessments. But also, and very important, it has to tell you who is responsible for offering these services. So is it school-based support? Is it a specific agency that needs to be linked for your child to be able to receive and be able to accomplish these transition activities? All that has to be included. Transition activities could include not just what's mentioned here, but pieces like travel training, creating, what else? I'm blanking on this right now, but just internship experiences, or daily acquisition of daily living skills, very specific to a student's particular needs. And then who's going to be offering it? It really is a very useful tool for students. And the reminder again is that it has to be need-based. Now, I think we're halfway through the presentation and we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to transition this to Kim and I'll be taking care of the Q&A. Thanks.
Hi, all right, and so I apologize. We're gonna go through this. I think we obviously are gonna be running a little bit over. You can go to the next slide, Liliana. And we are trying to keep up with the questions. I think one question that's come up a few times is about, will you get a copy of the slides? Absolutely, if you registered, if we have your email, if you take our survey, we'll get you a copy of the slides. It usually takes a couple of days for us to send that out with the presentation. And also this will be recorded. So if you do end up having to jump off, this will be available online. Another question that's come up is how to handle things when the school isn't agreeing, which obviously we're giving you what should happen. And then reality is sometimes different. So we do have a whole section on that at the end that we'll talk about. But just going through section by section in the IEP, one of the next things that comes up is participation in state assessments. And for this, most students do participate in assessments. There is a section that's later on in the New York City pages for modified promotion that we'll talk about. Alt assessment, it's actually alternate assessment, but you usually hear it as alt assessment, is something that they reserve. They're only supposed to do it for 1% of students, and for students with severe cognitive disabilities. And on the bottom of the slide, there's a link to get you to that. So they should not be exempting a student from state assessments unless they have severe cognitive disabilities. This become a lot less fraught when they no longer connected promotion year by year to state tests, although you still do need to graduate with the regents. That may be changing. We actually had a lot of presentations on that, and that's a moving target. But as of now, you still need a certain number of credits and number of regents to graduate. Okay, next slide, Liliana. Thank you. And so on this theme of what students with disabilities, how they're included, this slide is one that I think a lot of people forget about. But it is supposed to spell out if there's a reason why a student should not be included. One of the more common calls that we get in the spring with a lot of field trips is parents calling and saying, the school's telling me my child can't go on the field trip unless I go because of behavior, because of whatever. If this section doesn't say underneath the sort of the middle of the page, explain to the extent the student won't participate in regular class, extracurricular, or non-academic activities, they should be fully included, and they shouldn't make a parent go. Similarly, this is also a section where if a student gets adaptive PE, which is typically given for students with physical disabilities, it would say it here. And also, there was actually already a question in the chat that got a little complex, so I did my best with it, but I may have to get back to you with a more detailed answer. For high school students, if you have a disability and they decide you're exempt, you don't have to take a second language. Most high school students, to get a diploma, have to take a second language and pass that. But if you have a disability and this box is checked, and it's pretty easy usually to get it checked, so I'm surprised a school is fighting you on that. But that's something that you can be exempt from the second language requirement. Okay, so transportation accommodations. We get a lot of calls about transportation. In fact, this year, I think transportation was the #1 issue, unfortunately, on our helpline in the beginning of the year. It's often, there's a lot of different ways it can go wrong. One of the first is not getting it on the IEP or getting it into OPT's system correctly. So you really do want to review this if your child gets specialized transportation and needs lots of different accommodations. So for example, you want to make sure that this is something that spells out if your child uses a wheelchair, that it's a lift bus, for example, and all the different things your child might need are spelled out on here. One other thing you can do, and we'll get into at the end how to do it, but there's a new website, or new within the past few years that they've been using it so much, called My Student. If you don't have a My Student account, I would really strongly encourage you to talk to your child's school about getting one. You can go online and find it, but you do need a code from your school to sign in the first time. But there's lots and lots of information on there, and they keep adding things to it. And for example, they are adding transportation accommodations there. And they no longer say, if you already get busing, you probably have already experienced this, but they don't send out those letters they used to send that would tell you your child's bus route and bus company. The only way you know is if the bus company calls you, or you look on My Student. If you look at the accommodations and they don't list everything your child needs, get a doctor's letter and be really specific. It's not enough to say my child has a disability and needs limited time travel. You want to say why your child needs limited time travel, if they have fatigue issues or seizures or whatever it is that makes it difficult for them to be on a bus for a long time, you want to be specific. The default for limited time, believe it or not, is 60 minutes. So, and that's within boroughs. So if you want something shorter, you're going to have to be much more specific about why that's needed. You also, even if it's on here, you want to double check with the bus company. And if there's problems, call your school and ask them to file a complaint with OPT. That's actually how it's supposed to happen. But you can still also call OPT yourself. You want to try to get complaint numbers and keep track of it. I hate saying this because I know it's a lot of work. I've done it myself as a parent. But keep calling every time there's a problem, because they do respond if there's a whole clump of escalations, but not always if there's just one or two. So placement recommendation. This is another thing that it used to be easier to figure out on an IEP what type of school a student was in. You could see it in that program slide that Liliana reviewed earlier. Now, one of the only places you can see it is at the end, where we have 3 different kinds of placement recommendations from 3 different IEPs. The first one you can see is a DOE non-specialized school, like a district 1 through 32. That just means your local school. The next one is a DOE specialized school. That's code for district 75. And the last one you can see that spells it out a little bit more clearly. It's a New York State approved non-public school, or residential. In this case, it's residential, but it could also be a day program. Okay. And the 2 that I'm sorry, can you go back, Liliana? The 2 programs that are the same in D1 through 32 and District 75, that every year we get calls from people who thought they were in one, but it turns out they're in the other. If your child has a 12 to 1-to-1 recommendation and you're not positive what they're recommending, I would encourage you to look at this page on the IEP, because it's really the only way you'll be able to tell, is this a 12 to 1-to-1 in a District 1 through 32 school, or a District 75 school. And there's a big difference between those, so it's an important distinction. Okay, so I think one more. Yeah, see, city summary pages. You can go, yeah, that one is fine. So these pages, if you're wondering why the heck is the IEP drafted like this, I mean, we wonder too. It sometimes seems like it's designed to be tough to read, because it is. But how it's divided is the whole first part that we were going through. Those were all the pages that are mandated by New York State. So if you move to a different area in New York State, you should see something that's really similar to that. The end of the IEP is what's called the city. It's not labeled this, but it's New York City specific pages. One thing that we actually advocated for at ASC when they changed the IEP, and I think this was like over a decade ago, but they didn't have anywhere on the IEP that reflected what the parents' language was. They had the students' language, but not the parents. And obviously for school staff, it's really important to know what the parents' language is. There are other systems in the DOE that reflect that, but for a parent to know what the system says they speak is important. The other thing that is surprisingly tough to find is the date of the meeting. So this page, which is usually in the last few pages, is the only place you can see when the meeting happened. Another really important thing to look at if you're trying to understand, especially this is for professionals, it can be for parents too, if you're trying to look through years of IEPs and piece them together and figure out the history, is whether or not it was a change. So if it's an amendment or a reconvene, meaning a parent said there's an issue, I want to talk about a change, the yes box should be checked. In this example, it's a student where it was just an annual IEP, and they should not be changing a program in that. Sometimes they do, but they shouldn't be. Also, the instructional functional levels at the end, these are typically filled out by somebody on the IEP team, usually a teacher, and you would think they would line up with the present levels of performance pages, but they don't always. So it's another place to look. What does the teacher think the student is working on? Okay, this is just a flat out summary of, it's actually not a bad place to see, are they participating in statewide assessments? Do they have a behavior plan, et cetera? But this is a repeat of information that's listed earlier. And then this is actually the only section. It's another thing that used to be in an IEP when you looked at one from years and years ago, but got eliminated with the state IEP. It's the only section that puts whether or not there's a medical alert for a student. So that can be really important for a school to know. It's also the only section that lists out if you have a child that has accessibility needs, so they use a walker or a wheelchair or crutches or whatever. This is the only section that will say, does the student need an accessible school building? Do they have limited mobility? Do they use a wheelchair? Do they use walking aids? So it's an important section if that applies to you. And this is something, I think I explained it a little bit earlier with the state assessments. Promotion criteria is something we used to see a ton. And now, since they said you can be promoted and it's not based on your state test scores, it's not exclusively based on your state test scores, we see it less and less. And it's something that I always feel like it's problematic if something only works in New York City. Modified promotion is only in New York City. It's not, you can't get it if you go out of New York City. What it means is that they basically are lowering the bar. So for this student, and by the way, even though there's names in these IEPs, we now have fancy Adobe and could, redact them. So these are fake names. But for Cassandra, they lowered her promotional criteria. It's a little bit unclear actually what they lowered it to here. Usually you used to see if she was in 5th grade, you'd see 2nd grade. It's not so clear here, but what they're basically saying is we don't anticipate that she's going to meet standard promotion criteria, and this is what we're holding her to. One thing that I would say is if you're a parent who's seeing this being applied, I feel like if they're recommending this, they should always be recommending more support. It shouldn't be a new recommendation without more support. Because if you think about it, if they're lowering the bar, why? If they think somebody needs more help, shouldn't they be giving them more support to get over the bar? So it sometimes can be, not always, but can be a little bit of an alarm bell to look at. Okay, other options considered. I know Liliana earlier said, this is the page we always flip right to with a listing of programs. This is another page we flip right to. Often it's very generic and it says, this was not supportive enough and this was too restrictive. Sometimes you see something that's a little bit more spelled out. We once saw a school, or more than once actually, saw a school say, well, this child needs a small class, but we don't have one here. They're not supposed to write that, but I actually really appreciated that school's honesty, because at least we could understand, what were you thinking? Legally, they're not supposed to do that, but practically they did, and it actually really helped that student get the right setting from the DOE because they were honest about what the student needed. If you're asking for a program or a service, somebody said music therapy. I feel like every time I do these trainings, I love them because I learn something new. And there's a question that I'm like, I haven't heard of that being given on an IEP. I've heard of music therapy, of course. But if it's something that you really argued for, you had evaluations that supported and they rejected it, they should write here why they rejected it. So that's something to keep an eye on. Okay, so attendance is the last page that in an IEP, and sometimes you don't see this until afterwards. If it's a phone IEP or a Zoom, you're not going to have a chance to sign it. If you are in person, and that's happening more and more, one thing that I've seen parents do that I learned from as a parent and copied somebody else that I encountered through my job was sign in your name and put a date right on that line and then take a picture of it. Because at least then you know when the meeting was. I mean, if you have a super organized calendar, maybe you do, but you can keep track of things, especially when you're looking through years of IEPs. You should also know that one person can fill out more than one line. So in this, Anne Marie Christopher was signed in as the district rep and the school psychologist. If this is the same IEP as the one we were looking at earlier, the redacted one, they didn't actually need a school psychologist if it was an annual, but it looks like they had one. And by law, there's a whole other training on this, but certain members are required if they're going to change an IEP. Okay. What's not on the IEP, there's no dedicated place for diploma options. That's something that changed. Diploma options are something that you really should be asking about early and make sure you're on the same page with. One great thing with my student is there's a whole section on how to see if your child, how many credits your child has, what regions they've taken. It's not great on understanding all the different ways in which there's alternative pathways for students with disabilities. We have a lot of resources on our website for that, and it can be complex, but I would really dive into it if you have a high school student. Also, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the only place the date of the IEP is included is in the summary section, and the section headers track the language of the IDEA. Okay, we keep going. Okay, so the IEP meeting, who's at the IEP meeting is this group of people. I think we can skip this for now, Liliana, because we got late, so we'll keep going. Tips for it, I guess the one that I would say here is make sure you get copies of reports or evaluations before the meeting. It's not a great place to be sitting and trying to digest a complex psychological evaluation. I know I said this earlier, but get a copy of the attendance sheet. If you can, you definitely want to get a draft of the IEP meeting after the meeting. I know somebody asked a question in the chat about it's taking them 2 months to finalize it. That is too long. There's not actually, unfortunately, a hard date by when they have to finalize it. They're supposed to send a copy to the parent within 10 days of when it's finalized. That's in the DOE Standard Operating Procedures Manual, which we actually should put in the Q&A because it's a great link for people to have, but you can get a draft of it and ask for changes before it's finalized. You can ask for changes after it's finalized, but it's a different process for them to do that. Okay, so sorting through the papers. First of all, you always want to know what are your child's needs. So sometimes people think like, well, I want this kind of therapy, but why? You need to make sure you understand what the needs are the evaluations correct? If they're not correct, work on getting new evaluations. And then assuming you have that, does the IEP describe those needs correctly? I know they're hard to read. That's why we thought we should do a whole training on just reading section by section the IEP, because for any of us, it can get a little boring as you're reading through it. But as a parent, it's not boring when you read through it and it's somebody else's kid's name in there and you're like, did you even get this right? Make sure it describes your child. If it doesn't, correct it. I mean, it's up to you if you want to really nitpick. I get my child's IEP and some years I just make sure the program and the transportation is right and I don't worry about anything else. Other years I feel like I take a deeper dive into it and make sure it's accurate, especially before any kind of transition. So if you're moving to middle or high school or to college, you really want to make sure that IEP is correct. And then, of course, one question that's already come up quite a few times is your child actually getting what's on the IEP? If not, why not? And trying to understand how to make that happen. And we'll go through escalating a bit at the end. Is the program working? So sometimes, your child might be getting speech therapy, but the speech therapist does not know how to provide the speech therapy your child needs. So that's something where making sure they have the right skills or training, and maybe there's other support that's needed. Okay, language access rights are important. Obviously, this is tough enough to understand if English is your first language, and it's impossible to understand if it's not and you don't get things translated. Parents have a right to get documents translated, including report cards and IEPs. They have a right to actual professional interpretation services at school meetings and events. It shouldn't be bring your other child to translate for you or interpret for you. We do see that. And it's in the top languages, which are listed here. If you have problems with translation or interpretation, you can email hello@schools.nyc.gov or call this complaint number. Okay, so questions. You know what, let's keep going, Liliana, and try to get through the rest of it. I think people are putting, and I appreciate it, people are putting their questions in the chat. I'm going to go through the data very quickly, but I talked about this earlier. There is a way to get at my student portal, and this is great. In fact, I think this might be an old screenshot, and there's even more things in there. The IEP, for example, unfortunately, is not a link to the document, but it is a link to a section that has the program, and actually, really importantly, in the beginning of the new school year, the teacher and therapist names. So you can tell who are they saying is providing this, when was the first date of service. It has assessments listed there, and academic supports as well. Another thing that we try to tell people about, a common question as well, how do I even know if my child is getting what's on their IEP? Or if the school I'm applying to actually serves students with IEPs. In the school quality reports, there's lots and lots of data on the DOE's webpage, and I encourage you to look for it. But this is one place that they added this last year, and it's really great, or actually, I guess maybe a couple years ago, but they've expanded it, where they put specifically by school how many students received their recommended special education programs. This is a high school, for example, where only 38% of the students got what was on their IEP. And in terms of related services, 77% got them in full. So this is something to look at, and it doesn't mean that your child isn't getting the services. They could be one of the lucky 38%, but it does mean you might want to ask a little bit tougher questions and confirm with your child, are you really getting, special class or ICT in all your subjects? And speaking of small class or ICT, this is one place where you can look it up on the school quality reports, where you can see in this school, it looks like they mostly serve students through ICT. You can see of the 97 students with disabilities, or with IEPs, I should say, 68 of them are in an ICT class. If you go to the next slide, Liliana, this is actually my favorite report that's on the DOE. It does open a monster Excel sheet, so make sure your computer or your phone, if you're doing it on your phone, can handle it. But you can scroll down and find your child's school. This is just a snapshot. It's actually much longer in terms of rows and columns, and see how many students are in an ICT class total, how many sections there are, what grade it is. So it's really, really helpful if you're trying to understand what a school actually provides. And it's the most up to date. Okay, so what to do if you disagree with the DOE? It comes up a lot. I think, the first thing we would say, you can go to the next slide, Liliana, is to start with the school. And hopefully that's obvious, but sometimes people will talk to a teacher, be so frustrated with the teacher that they want to go straight to the superintendent. You really should try going to the principal first. In my own experience as a parent, one of the best pieces of advice I got from a teacher I was talking to about something I was upset was how to approach the principal. So I think finding your allies in the school and making sure you can talk to them about, what should I do? This is what they're telling me. So the person who said there's not enough providers, what do I do? Maybe trying to ask, anybody in the school who feels like an ally, how do they suggest you resolve it? And making sure you do go up the chain. So you want to know what the principal is saying. If that doesn't work, though, then the next step up is the superintendent's office. And there's a family support coordinator or a district family advocate there. If you don't get a response or a response you like from them, you can also go to DOE Central and email at specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov or call that number. And sometimes people have a lot of success with a chain that includes everybody. but I would probably start going up the chain a little bit more sequentially, especially if it's an issue that can be resolved. Because if your child is in public school, you're going to be working things out with them for a while. And at the bottom, and we will be sending these slides to everybody, there's a link to get the contact info for everyone. Okay, but if you're in the unfortunate position where it's still not working, you do have rights under the IDEA, and one of them is mediation. So you can ask for a voluntary meeting. The DOE, the school has to agree to do this. And everybody sits down with a mediator to facilitate and have the conversation. It tends to work well when it's something where people are just butting heads. So for somebody who was saying like, well, why are they exempting her from, or not exempting her from the Spanish or whatever it is, the other language, I think you were saying, that could be something that works through mediation. There's not a huge time crunch. You want to maintain good relations with the school, but maybe you're butting heads with a teacher or with the psychologist, and doing a mediation can help air everything. I mean, you may be able to resolve it on your own, but sometimes it can work really well. Other times, unfortunately, in New York City, you end up having to go to an impartial hearing. And this is where the school, maybe they even agree with you, but they don't feel like they have the power to give it to you. And that's a legal proceeding where there's an impartial hearing officer in charge. You do get a written decision. It's based on witnesses and documents. It's not, you don't need to be a lawyer to go through one, but it is awfully legalistic feeling. There's, direct and cross, and it is something that parents do successfully navigate it on their own all the time. But it's a lot nicer to have a lawyer if you can. And for somebody who's thinking, I need private school, or you're signing a contract for tens of thousands of dollars of tutoring, you probably want to consider a lawyer at that point. As Liliana said earlier, we do represent low-income families. Unfortunately, we can't represent everyone who calls, but there are a huge range of lawyers in New York City who do handle special education cases. Okay, so final review, and I apologize for talking like an engineer, but I mean auctioneer, but I'm only about 15 minutes over, so thank you for everyone that stayed with us. The IEP is a legal document, and that was the main focus of today. We do have a lot of other trainings on our YouTube site and a lot of other guides on our website about other areas. Our main focus today was trying to just dive into the IEP and really read it because it's important, but it's not easy. And it does contain mandated services that your child needs to progress. You as a parent are a key member of the IEP team. One of the most frequently things that we're correcting in DOE guides is they say the IEP team and the parent, but the parent is a part of the IEP team. And so you should really, it often feels like it's you against a whole team of people. And of course, those people do sit next to each other every day. But you are absolutely a member of the team. So if they're looking at something ahead of time, you should have it too. And of course, this should go without saying, but you are going to have the best knowledge of who your child is as a person, not just their disability, but what works for them, what doesn't work for them, what's worked in the past, what you're hoping for in the future. And they really should be respecting your child's needs and your input on what your child's needs are. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes that's a great way if you're sensing things go veering off in an IEP, is to try to probe a little bit more about, well, why are you recommending that? But I'm not sure I understand. So for example, at my son's IEP, almost every year a PT would say, well, we need to reduce his services. And we would say, but well, why? Tell me why, because he needed PT. He's got a neuromuscular disability, definitely needed it. And they would say, well, he's getting pulled out a lot. This is an elementary school and he's missing academics. And so then we would say, oh, I really appreciate that. It's good to know. And then would ask his teachers, do you feel like it's interfering with academics? And invariably they would say no. And they would say, well, we don't think that makes sense then. And the PT, it would turn out, had marching orders in terms of that caseload is too high, try to reduce stuff. And it wasn't an individualized determination. And as I got used to this negotiation or the oddness of IEP meetings, I started realizing that some of those people are coming into it, even if they seem like an ally. Like, I liked my son's PTs a lot. My son loved them. Was that they have their role and their lines. And so making sure that you play your role and you know your lines to push back for your child. Because if you don't ask, then, you know, they certainly are just gonna do what their marching orders were from above. Okay, upcoming webinars. I know there were a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A on what if my child's not getting services. We have a whole training on that coming up for related services on April 11th, and navigating school discipline, which unfortunately we've been seeing a rise in cases of school discipline issues. That's at the end of April. So now we can get to the, we have some feedback survey questions. So if you can complete those, and we're happy to answer any questions that are left or that we haven't answered. So Liliana, do you want to unmute? I'm sorry, stop recording, and then if anybody wants to speak, we can do that.
Let's do that. So for the time being, thank you so much for joining us. We'll stop the recording, and remember, we'll get a copy of this IEP, and this will be archived on our YouTube page. And now we'll get questions.